Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Martin Van Buren, and the focus is no second chance. The year is 1840. It's been a tough year for Van Buren as President of the United States. The economy had been in the tank. Not many things went well. He had very few legislative successes to his name, and this was going to be a tough re-election campaign. The question was, who is he going to have to run against? And the opposition had really coalesced around this new political party called the Whigs, and they were seeking their presidency for the first time. Henry Clay had really established the Whig Party around his American system, which promoted things like federally funded internal improvements and high protective tariffs, America first kind of perspective. And the problem was that Clay was deemed too controversial for the Whigs at the time. And so while he very much wanted the nomination and the presidency, he was pushed off to the side, and one of his protégés, William Henry Harrison, the former military hero from the War of 1812 and the former governor of the Indiana Territory, he was put forward as the nominee for the Whigs. Now, this was a very bizarre campaign in 1840, and it started with a notice in the Baltimore Republican newspaper, right after Harrison had gotten the nomination from the Whigs. And the Republican reported, "Give him a barrel of hard cider and settle a pension of $2,000 a year on him," talking about Harrison, "and my word for it, he will sit the remainder of his days in his log cabin." Well, that launched the Log Cabin and Hard Cider campaign. Harrison was portrayed as this man of the people, a commoner, one of them, a military hero, an all-American success story, and with his partner John Tyler, the former Democrat, now Whig, you've got Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Tippecanoe being the site of one of Henry Harrison's victories when he was a military officer. Tippecanoe and Tyler too, and folks across the country stood up these log cabins where they held campaign rallies. And of course, they served a lot of hard cider, and they sang songs and songs. There were dozens of songs created just for this campaign, supporting Harrison and attacking Martin Van Buren. Well, never mind the fact that this was not an accurate portrayal of William Henry Harrison and John Tyler, who happened to have hailed from among the wealthiest families in Virginia. Harrison's father had signed the Declaration of Independence. Tyler's father had been governor of Virginia. These were not common men by any way, shape, or form. In fact, Harrison's log cabin, which had a few logs in it in Ohio, was 16 rooms. This was not the poor commoner, right, trying to rise to the top. But the propaganda worked, and it really generated a lot of momentum and support from the common man for the campaign of William Henry Harrison. As for Martin Van Buren, it was frankly the opposite. He had 4 tough years that he was running on a very difficult record, but he was also portrayed in a very negative light as an elitist, someone who was a dandy with these fancy clothes that he always strutted around in, his fancy stagecoach and food and dinnerware that was, again, of the fancier nature. A congressman by the name of Charles Ogle of Pennsylvania went on the attack by saying, "In my opinion, it is time the people of the United States should know what their money goes to buy for their plain, hard-handed Democratic president. Knives, forks, and spoons of gold, that he may dine in the style of the monarchs of Europe. What, sir, will the honest locofoco say to Mr. Van Buren for spending the people's cash for green finger cups and wish to wash his pretty, tapering, soft white lily fingers after dining?" Well, that was the picture that was painted of this, again, this elitist version of Martin Van Buren, who was really not this way if you look back at his history. He was born from nothing. He grew up on the farm in upstate New York in Kinderhook. He rose himself up through his own educational efforts, his own tenacity, his own skills, where he reached the height of state-level politics in New York before moving on to the national scene. Sure, he wore fancy clothes and he did appear to be a bit of a dandy, but he was a man of the people from his original roots. This is, again, not how he was portrayed, and these portrayals really stuck in the minds of the masses, and the masses were increasingly mattering. Democracy was indeed expanding in this era. 2.5 million people showed up to vote in 1840, a 60% increase over the previous canvass. And about 80% of the voters, eligible voters, actually showed up. So democracy had its say, and that say went clearly in the new direction of William Henry Harrison, who beat Van Buren easily in the Electoral College by a vote of 234 to 60. Van Buren was okay. He was going to hold his head high. He was ready to return to New York. In fact, he wrote an open letter to the folks in New York by saying, "I come to you now with a political ambition more than satisfied by the many and distinguished honors which have been conferred upon me, and with no higher aspirations, if there be higher, than to occupy the station, enjoy the privileges, and discharge the duties of an American citizen." He was saying all the right things, ready to bow out off to the side, while Harrison took over in Washington. Well, in Washington, things didn't stay stable for very long because Harrison died after just 1 month in office and John Tyler elevated to the presidency. And this was a shock to the system because while Tyler had run as a Whig, he was really still a Democrat. He had left the Democratic Party mainly out of a personal run-in that he had with Jackson. They couldn't get along anymore, so he left the party, and now he's president of the United States. But not from the Whig perspective. He was ideologically still aligned with the Democrats, and he started taking out his veto pen and vetoing Whig legislation coming from Congress left and right. It created an uproar in the nation's capital, and it also did not bode very well for the Whigs going forward, having all of this sort of chaos on their watch. So eyes were already thinking about the next election of 1844, and Martin Van Buren was once again a leading contender to be the Democratic nominee. And he didn't just sit back during these 4 years at Lindenwold, his new home. He took a big trip, a political trip to the South to gain support. He went through a dozen states. He even had a nice meeting with President Jackson in the Hermitage in Tennessee, the last time they would meet face to face, and all support seemed to be aligning around Martin Van Buren. But then an issue came to the fore that made all this go away, and that issue was Texas. Texas had come onto the scene in the middle of the Jackson administration when it won its independence from Mexico. And Jackson wanted to bring Texas into the Union, but he couldn't get it done in his administration. And Van Buren, this is the one area that he really differed with Jackson. He thought that if he tried to bring in his presidency, if he tried to bring Texas into the Union, it would mean certain war with Mexico, and he was unwilling to take that risk, so he did not move in that direction. But John Tyler, knowing he wasn't up for re-election, he only had a few months left in his administration, and he was pushing as hard as he could to annex Texas into the American Union. Plus, the Whigs had gotten hold of a document that Jackson had written about a year before, continuing to echo his pro-Texas advocacy to bring Texas into the American Union. There was a lot of noise around Texas at the time, and people wanted to know, where did the candidates sit on this topic? Well, Henry Clay was in the running to be the nominee for the Whigs after the debacle of the Harrison and Tyler administration. He came out against annexation. Despite that, even though that alienated a bunch of folks in the South who were originally supportive of Clay, he still had the nomination locked up, and Clay would be the standard bearer for the Whigs in 1844. But what about the Democrats? What about Martin Van Buren? Now, Martin Van Buren could have remained silent. In fact, he had always given advice to candidates not to come out and make controversial statements or any statements of any kind during campaigns because they usually go against you. But he didn't take his own advice. He decided that on this topic, rather than sit on his past record and remain silent, in which case he most likely would have gotten the nomination and he would have been elected president of the United States for a second time, he decided to make a statement about his position on Texas. And it was not a small statement. It was a 10,000-word statement that he wrote in a letter to William Hammett on the eve of the Democratic Convention. And he came out with a historical reference of why he had previously opposed immediate annexation of Texas, and then an explanation about why he continued to be against it. The United States had a treaty with Mexico, and Mexico did not recognize Texas. This could be a violation of that treaty. It would not play well in nations across the world. And yes, Mexico would come after the United States and issue a declaration of war. In the Hammett Letter, Van Buren said, "The acquisition of so valuable a territory by means which are of questionable propriety would be a departure from those just principles upon which this government has ever acted, and which have excited the admiration and secured the respect of the dispassionate and enlightened friends of freedom throughout the world." He wouldn't take this risk if he were elected president of the United States, and he knew the risk of writing this letter. The last line of the Hammett Letter, of the 10,000 plus words, he wrote, "Nor can I in any extremity be induced to cast a shade over the motives of my past life by changes or concealments of opinions maturely formed upon a great national question, for the unworthy purpose of increasing my chances for political promotion." This was as disinterested and selfless a statement as somebody like John Adams would have made. Not a Martin Van Buren, who had done the opposite his entire life, gaining elections. This was his specialty. He was the great magician. And he, of course, would never have advised any of his friends to write such a letter, but he was in a different place. And he decided he was going to take a stand, and he was going to make it clear where he stood on the issue of Texas, and sure enough, it cost him the presidency. The South completely deserted Van Buren. They would no longer support his candidacy, and even Andrew Jackson, his loyalist supporter who had been there through thick and thin with Van Buren, wrote Van Buren a letter saying that it was impossible to elect him. He had effectively taken himself out of the running because of this particular stand. Well, it was still up to the convention. The Democrats met in Baltimore, and the real question was this two-thirds rule. The two-thirds rule was put in place to help Martin Van Buren way back in 1836 when he was running in 1832 when he was running for vice president of the United States, and the Democrats wanted to make sure he would get there, and so they passed this two-thirds rule to make it a high bar so nobody could slip in with a bare majority and take it from him. Well, the question was, would the two-thirds rule be in place here in 1844? It had gone away, it had come back, and if it stayed in place, Van Buren was never going to have a chance because the South had completely avoided him now. The question is, would it stay in place? And sure enough, on the first vote of the day, the two-thirds rule was passed, and Van Buren's chances effectively went by the wayside. He had a majority on the first ballot because of the committed delegates that came to the convention, but they quickly went away. By the fifth ballot, he was no longer leading. The convention eventually deadlocked. They looked for a dark horse candidate, and they went into Jackson's Tennessee and plucked out James Polk, the former Speaker of the House, who was nominated on the ninth ballot and eventually beat Henry Clay in the fall election. Well, Martin Van Buren, the great magician, in this case, put principle over politics. The magic didn't work because he didn't follow his typical political advice. He put principle first. It cost him the presidency of the United States. There would be no second chance in the White House for Martin Van Buren. And that is Martin Van Buren and No Second Chance, from the life of Martin Van Buren. For more Presidential Chronicles, check out my books from Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.